Hello, A Push. So I want to finish off those notes we had in the Jefferson era that we started today. So what we talked about, Jefferson era, Jefferson comes into office, Federalists, Republicans, we're all both of them, meaning we're trying to unite the country. Generally speaking, he shrinks down the government. The court, Supreme Court becomes more powerful. We deal with a bunch of pirates. We deal with some French issues. We buy the Louisiana Purchase. There's a conspiracy with Aaron Burr, and that is where I left you off. So there are still things happening on the frontier. And as long as we have a frontier, there's things happening on the frontier. Out in the state of what will become Indiana, there is a conflict with Native Americans. The governor of Indiana territory is William Henry Harrison. He is going to eventually become the shortest serving U.S. president, but at the time, he's this rugged frontiersman. And basically, what he is going to do is try to keep the Native Americans in line. Now, Jefferson is going to make, quote, an offer to Native Americans. What he's going to say to Native Americans is, you need to be assimilated, meaning you need to give up your current cultures and become Americanized. He says, yeah, become American citizens, start farming, develop Christianity, and that's your offer. We'll assimilate you into U.S. culture and everything will be lovely. However, most Native Americans don't want to give up their culture. Like if somebody said to you, hey, why don't you become more African? Well, if that isn't where you've been from, you're probably not going to want to adopt it. So there's an organization on the frontier of Native Americans organized by a chief named Tecumseh and his religious cohort, the Prophet. Tecumseh and the Prophet then are going to, on the frontier, fight against the United States government in Indiana. And they're going to get help from the British. The British are like, hey, we can cause some problems in the frontier, stick it to the Americans. And Tecumseh and the Prophet end up getting weapons. And at the Battle of Tippecanoe, William Henry Harrison, the governor of Indiana, is going to command U.S. troops in the middle of rural Indiana, which at the time is largely a forest, and they're going to beat the army of Tecumseh and the Prophet, which up until that time was the largest Native American army that had ever been assembled. This Battle of Tippecanoe is pivotal, and it ends up giving Indiana to whites. And from that point on, Indiana is going to end up being quickly settled. I think Indiana becomes a state by maybe 1815, somewhere in there. So Ohio has now fallen from Native Americans to Americans, and the Indian territory, or Indiana, sorry, has also fallen. And this makes William Henry Harrison into a war hero, which he will later propel into the presidency, which he will then die after giving his inaugural address, and we'll get more of that later. Okay, so election of 1809, there really isn't a major conflict. Jefferson ends up not running for another term. The tradition has been you run for 2 terms based on Washington. Jefferson is out, and James Madison ends up winning pretty handily against Pinckney and DeWitt Clinton from New York State. You'll notice there's still a few bits of the Federalist Party left up here in New England, but generally speaking now we're left with the Democratic Republicans in charge. There starts to be an emergence of people pushing for the War of 1812. Don't call it the War of 1812 yet, it's the war with England. So there's a group who we'd call the Warhawks. Okay, a hawk. Hawks, aggressive animals. These are not doves, pacifists. These Warhawks are people who live in the West and the South. Okay, Westerners and Southerners see that fighting against Native Americans would be good. And you're like, what do Native Americans have to do with the British? Native Americans are getting aid from the British. So if you attack Britain, it gives you an excuse to attack Native Americans and take land from the British. Take land from Native Americans. You can also, here's another thing, you can invade Canada. And the hope is if you invade Canada, you have more territory. So a lot of the reasons for the War of 1812 are to acquire Western and Northern territory. There's some native issues in there. Additionally, the British are going to be impressing U.S. soldiers or sailors, which I already talked about. This has continued for a period of time. Now, Macon Bills number 2. Macon Bills number 2 is a bill through Congress that essentially said, hey, we'll make peace with whatever country in Europe decides to stop attacking our ships. So if the French stop attacking our ships, we will join with the French, or at least allow trade with the French and not the British. So under this, we are trying to encourage one of the sides to stop going after us. And believe it or not, the British were about to give up impressment and about to agree to stopping U.S. ships. However, the drive for war becomes almost impossible to stop once there was a lot of public opinion saying, yeah, let's do this. And no, America was not ready for this war. We did not have a large military. It's probably a bad idea. But we end up declaring war on the British, and there isn't any particular action that did it. It was a lot of momentum of saying, hey, they're arming the natives. Hey, they attacked our ships. But above all, it's an excuse to take territory. All right. So what happens in the War of 1812? First, immediately the United States is going to invade Canada. Now, that doesn't go so hot. While in Canada, we go into Canada and we go to the city of what is today known as Toronto, which was York, and we burn part of it down. So yes, the United States does war atrocities by burning down part of Toronto. Remember this because it is going to inspire the British to do some things to us. On the frontier, there is fighting. And on the frontier, kind of a draw. Native Americans win some. The Americans win others. On the Great Lakes, there's also fighting on the Great Lakes, Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. On those two lakes, the British end up, I think, with Lake Ontario, and the Americans end up with Lake Erie. In fact, today, both lakes are really deep, and the ruins of the ships that were sunk there are actually still well preserved. In 1814, the British make a move to cut America in half. And to that end, they do essentially a surprise attack on Washington, D.C. D.C. is super surprised. In fact, James Madison, the president, is forced to retreat so quickly that when the British got there, James Madison food was still on the table in the White House, and British were able to eat his dinner. DC then has partially burned. They actually burn the White House. In fact, the name White House comes from this era because after the White House burns down, it has scorch marks on the side, and the citizens of Washington, D.C. come out after the British leave and whitewash the building, making it appear white. And in fact, there have been renovations since this period of time, even up into the 1990s, where they have scraped off the paint on the outside of the White House, and the scorch marks are still there. So, in an attempt to fully take the middle of the United States, the British approach Baltimore, which is north of D.C. Baltimore is guarded by a Fort McHenry. In the course of trying to take out Fort McHenry, the British are stopped. There was an American lawyer named Francis Scott Key on one of the British ships. Why is he there? He'd been taken prisoner in Washington, D.C. And while he's there, he's looking out at this battle. It looks like America might lose, but he looks at Fort McHenry in the harbor and sees this giant American flag. An American flag is really big. We're talking like the size of a classroom. So he can see it, goes to bed, gets up, and the next day the flag is still there. He proceeds then to write the Star-Spangled Banner about Fort McHenry holding up. So the Americans, we're holding our own. Yeah, we lose Canada, but we hold our own on the frontier. During the whole thing, there's a proposal in New England to have New England leave the Union. Why? Because trade had been cut off with England, and Britain's the biggest partner with New England. So there's this brief period of flirting with creating their own country up here in New England. Now, the Hartford Convention is that. Hartford Convention ends up failing, and they don't end up leaving the Union. Final thing that happens. Battle of New Orleans. Battle of New Orleans is down here in New Orleans. British are like, hey, let's take the Mississippi. They're going to attack the city of New Orleans. New Orleans end up being protected by Andrew Jackson, who we will talk a lot more about later. Andrew Jackson is the top general. He gains an army of, believe it or not, some pirates and then some regular U.S. troops. They build these giant, barricades out of big cotton bales. And when the British approach, the Americans just wait, and the Americans end up killing hundreds of British soldiers, and only, I think, 10 or 11 Americans die. It is a rout of the British. They are destroyed, and Andrew Jackson becomes a household name. He will eventually propel this into the presidency. Interesting trivia. The war ends with the Treaty of Ghent. The Treaty of Ghent was signed in 1814. So believe it or not, the war had officially ended in 1814. Battle of New Orleans takes place after the Treaty of Ghent was signed. Why? because in New Orleans, they hadn't gotten the news yet. There is no cell phone, there is no telegraph. So even if Jackson had lost the Battle of New Orleans, the war is over. So, how's that turn out for America? Post war, good deal. What have we learned? That America can stand up. If America had lost the War of 1812, maybe we go back to being a British colony, but we are strong enough to resist being taken over. And this is the last time there's been any serious threat to the United States in terms of losing homeland territory. The war gains land on the frontier. These Native Americans are basically done fighting against the U.S. government in any kind of meaningful way. And yes, there's more fighting west of the Mississippi, but in terms of east of Mississippi, the party's over for most Native Americans. Additionally, the United States signs the Rush-Bagot Agreement, which solidifies our boundary with Canada. And in fact, we end up making the Great Lakes into a demilitarized zone. So neither Canada nor America have built up our navies in either area, and it's reduced tensions in those areas. The Rush-Bagot Agreement. And Florida is still not resolved. So in the 18 teens, Florida, which was controlled by the Spanish, becomes a refuge for escaped slaves and Native Americans. And in fact, Andrew Jackson will illegally invade Florida in the 18 teens, defying his president, and in fact becoming quite famous as an Indian hunter, which we'll get to more later. So that's where we leave the era of Jackson. We end, or Jefferson. The era of Jefferson really ends with the Madison presidency and the War of 1812. So that's it.